experts who will be sharing their insights on the wildfire crisis, its causes, and solutions. This will be an interactive webinar, so we invite you all to participate. Please use the chat feature on Zoom at any time to ask your questions, and we'll do our best to answer as many as possible during the Q&A segment, which will be held at the end of this webinar. If you can't get your questions in today or have any follow-up questions after the webinar, please feel free to send them to us at invest@parallelflight.com. I'll drop the link to that email address into the chat box shortly. And we'll be answering additional questions and sharing the recording of this video in an upcoming blog post on our website, parallelflight.com, and I'll provide the URL to that as well. With that, I will turn it over to Parallel Flight Technologies CEO, Joshua Resnick, who's going to be moderating today's webinar.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. And we're going to do a quick round of introductions with our panelists. We have retired Chief Scott Watson from CAL FIRE, and we have Rodrigo Neito Gomez from the Naval Postgraduate School, and Sevan Gerard, who is a firefighter in the Los Angeles area. As you know, I am the CEO and one of 3 co-founders of Parallel Flight Technologies, and we are building part of what we hope is going to be the solution to the wildfire crisis. But we're going to be talking very broadly about the causes and all of the solutions in this webinar. So why don't we start with retired Chief Scott Watson? Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Good afternoon. My name is Scott Watson. I'm a retired battalion chief from CAL FIRE. I worked 28.5 years for CAL FIRE. Prior to that, I worked for the U.S. Forest Service, and I'm a graduate in forestry.
Wonderful. And Sevan, why don't you go ahead?
Good afternoon, everybody. Sevan Gerard. I'm a firefighter in Los Angeles. Also, the bio says LA City Fire. I just want to make sure everybody understands anything that we discuss today is my perspective or opinion and is not endorsed by the fire department in any way. I'm a graduate also of the Naval Postgraduate School, and I'm pretty involved in emerging technologies and how they can be applied to public safety, and particularly this wildfire problem we have now.
Wonderful. And Rodrigo.
Hi, thank you so much for the invitation, Josh. I'm Rodrigo Neito. I'm a professor at the Naval Postgraduate School. I work in the fields of Homeland Security, and in this case, forest fire management has become part of our area of interest for obvious reasons. I operate in the areas of innovation theory and foresight, so thinking about what comes next to dealing with the emerging challenge of this important issue is one of the things that keeps me busy.
Wonderful. So thanks everybody for taking the time to be on this panel. Let's dive right into this. And you know, the wildfire crisis was really the impetus for me to found my company. But I've learned so much, you know, from that time about the causes and potential solutions. But from your perspectives, I'd love to just talk about what are the causes, both maybe the root cause, the deepest level cause, and then maybe other level causes for the wildfire crisis that we find ourselves in, which really seems to be a worldwide crisis. And why don't we kick this off with Scott Watson? Maybe you could give us your perspective on that.
Well, we've managed to accumulate about 85 years of fuels after about 1910 with a fire exclusion policy nationwide, and that peaked out about in the 80s sometime. So we have a gigantic fuel accumulation out there. And then you couple that with the death from sudden oak death syndrome, as well as the bark beetle infestations, that's added to the standing dead component out there. The weather has changed in that our summers are longer and drier and hotter. And there's a lot more people out there. So the risk factor is a lot higher because the ignition component has been greatly increased.
Right, right. And I think, you know, that hotter and drier element is really what kind of makes this a worldwide crisis and not just a, you know, not just a American or United States West Coast crisis. Rodrigo, maybe you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, that's correct. So while it is true that California has a series, almost like the perfect storm, and anybody who studies catastrophes, many of you will be familiar with the concept of normal accident theory. It's rarely a single element. It's actually the confluence of many of them. So while it is true that specific policies for the West Coast and the state of California might have aggravated circumstances given our climatological conditions and that backlog of kindled material now that are in part of it. It is also true that a drying and warming of the environment all over the globe as part of the extreme weather that we're getting because of climate change is making this more problematic. We've seen the fires in Australia. It seems like ages ago, but it was the beginning of 2020. It's just the nature of this year that those catastrophes seem so far into the past. But this year of bad news started with some of the biggest forest fires ever seen in Australia. Not too long ago, we might remember the fires in Sweden. So while it is true that California in particular, due to that backlog of fire suppression and also what urban planners call the wildland urban interface, right? The WUI, right? This fact that we are building closer to wildland. It is also true that we're seeing an increase in the footprint of career fires in many other nations of the globe.
Right. I think we've seen obviously big fires in Greece and in Russia, and even last season up in Alaska, which, you know, climatologically is very different from California. Sevan, what's your perspective here on causes?
Well, I think first of all, today or this year was kind of eye-opening, at least in respect to the California fires, because there was a significant complex that started from lightning. So I don't think many people realized how many fires were actually started by lightning. There's often this association that people make of lightning with rain, but there are many dry lightning events. I'm sure some other people that actually live in states that have normal weather are used to it, but these are things that sometimes are a little bit more rare on the West Coast. So that generally represents about 16% on average of all wildland fire causes. The other 84, and I use that number kind of loosely, but that's what some of the research is showing. The other 84% are human causes. And that's generally unintentional. And in certain cases, it's actually intentional. Arson, as well as something that's been documented in research, but has not really been found to be the case yet, fortunately, which is pyroterrorism. So the benefit of, I guess, the fact that most of them are caused by humans is that we do have the ability to kind of shape and drive behavior a little bit through good prevention measures, good public education, and things like that. So there is room for us to definitely improve on the prevention side, which I think needs a lot more discussion and conversation, and needs to enter the public forum a lot more at all stages of education, if you will, you know, early in school, college, more academics entering the research in this particular field of fire hazard. And I think that also gives us a good opportunity to look at the opportunity of what we can do with drones, particularly because most of these fires start as very small, little incipient accidental fires. And if we have a platform that can respond incredibly rapidly, that really changes our ability to reduce at least the number of fires that occur. The size is another question, And obviously, as Rodrigo mentioned, with the changes we're seeing in climate, the scope and scale of each incident is really changing. But we definitely have a huge impact if we can reduce the actual number of fires initiated.
Sure. Oh, that's great. And I think that that's a great segue into our next major topic area, which is the types of solutions that can be brought to bear. But before we go there, Sevan, you're bringing up the lightning as a cause of fire. And I just, I think our audience, I would just like to share that my family personally experienced that with the CZU lightning complex, and it was quite a terrifying experience. It was after midnight, I think. It was late at night, and all of a sudden the power went out, and our kids got scared and came into our bedroom, and then I started hearing from one side of our house that there was this really strong wind, and I went into this room to listen on that side of the house, and we just heard the wind picking up more and more, and then trees falling as this windstorm was coming closer to us, wind and lightning that was happening, and there really wasn't rain. It was a dry lightning storm, and this storm ignited hundreds of fires, and it was just really quite something. And then, of course, we had to evacuate, and the fire came within a mile of our home, and thankfully was saved by the efforts of both the local firefighters and CAL FIRE. But of course, I think around 1,500 structures burned, and 1,000 of them were single-family homes in that fire alone. So quite devastating for our area. I do see one question in the chat, which I want to address right now while we're talking about causes, and then we'll move on to solutions. So I'll just read it. It appears to be misleading to think that once the accumulated fuel has burned, the fires will be fewer and less intense. Firefighters reported that several of the recent fires burned through areas that had only burned a year or two ago. How should we think about areas that burned recently? Why are they at risk of burning again? Scott Watson, do you have knowledge of that or want to comment on that?
Well, sure. We'll use some of the fuels that are common here in California. You remove a brush field, or you remove a timber stand, the first species to come back in are going to be grasses, and grasses ignite really easily. A brush field will rejuvenate itself and be ready to burn within just a few years. So to think that a fire has gone through just a year or two ago, and therefore we won't have another fire, is not a sound way to approach this. Fire's natural in the ecosystem. It's going to occur, at a rate dependent on ignitions and also the fuel component, and it's going to be really affected by humankind and what we do out there. Some of our activities involving vehicles and some of our other activities is going to greatly affect that. So you have a greater component of ignitions, and if you have an area that's revegetating naturally, it's still going to be ready to burn. Annual grasses, they're ready to burn roughly in May or June once they go to seed, and we're not going to stop that. And then the other element that's contributing to that is the gigantic WUI component, the wildland-urban interface component, where you've got the fuels and the fire behavior, but now you've added to the complexity by having residences, primarily single-family residences in the wildland-urban interface mix, which dramatically affects fire suppression activities and limits a lot of the options that incident commanders have when it comes to fire suppression.
Right. That makes sense. Well, let's, I think this is a great segue to really get into what kind of solutions can be brought to bear here. And I think the thing that's pretty clear to even a casual observer is that if we just kind of keep doing more of the same, the best we can kind of expect is maybe a linear increase in effectiveness against wildfire, whereas the problem is kind of an exponential problem in terms of its growth. Rodrigo, can you comment maybe on that thought, and then, you know, lead us into where you think technology and then of course even policy can be brought to bear against this problem? Sure.
So California is going to burn, right? We have a Mediterranean weather that it's designed to burn. We know that some of our ecosystems are made for burning, in the sense that the success of some of the implantation of certain vegetation actually depends on this cycle of burn. That doesn't mean that we cannot intervene effectively in order to make this more manageable. So we are in a patchwork of risk, right? Parts of California are prone to earthquakes, others have fires, we have areas for flooding, we have agricultural spill, so you name it, right? The state is a patchwork of risk, and being very active and intelligent at dealing with those risks is gonna become one of the core challenges for public policy and urban development in the next 20 years. Fire is the most important one, is the most pressing one, is the most traumatic one. Part of this has to do with two kinds of behaviors. One is evidently rapid identification of fires, rapid detection. The second one is suppression when desired. And this is one of the things that I think we can imagine moving forward dramatically into a new state if the investments would be there. We're talking right now that, for example, just in the prescribed fires arena, California is burning around 20,000 acres per year. We're talking about maybe needing 1 million prescribed burns, 1 million acres of prescribed burns, just to get us to a level of equilibrium according to some of the models. But here's the deal. Most of the models that I'm talking about are lacking data. And the first thing we need is good sensors that tells us more information about the forest, and then better modeling efforts to decide how to better intervene. Because the second part of this is the creation of tools like the one that right there behind you, Josh, that would give us the capability to decide when we want to put a fire, when we want to start a fire, and leave human agency based in good understanding of mode to create basically a checkerboard of fires and fire suppression that protects intelligently the property and life of people and ecosystems at the same time. This means a leap forward in a generation. We're talking about going from bayonets to super carriers in order to create better sensors that are potentially available with the right kind of research and development, and then better rapid reaction capabilities, so we can get smarter about how to deal with this. And part of this reaction actually might be, and as we see already on industry, seeing some drones who actually are designed to start fires, some drones are designed to put out fires, and then some drones is designed to monitor the health of our forest to decide what kind of intervention. And this is kind of like the stock market, and you're building an algorithm that is trying to keep in balance, because the alternative is what we're seeing right now, right? The alternative of not doing anything and not going into this Marshall Plan of high tech is to see what we have and continue, because things, according to most forest fire modelers, are going to get much worse before they start to get better, if ever.
Interesting. And I guess this kind of makes me wonder, and I think, you know, I've learned a lot about this over the past couple of years, but I don't think the general public really understands some of the limitations around firefighting that we have right now. And I think this would be a great chance for Scott Watson to comment on what are some of the limitations specifically with aerial firefighting, kind of with the tools that we have right now, and what could be done to make that more effective?
Well, let me preface this question by stating that I was an aerial firefighter as a tactical officer on rotor wing helicopters for over 20 years. And I've worked on all sizes and dimensions of helicopters fighting fire, as well as in pre-fire work. So what are the limitations on aerial firefighting? Probably the primary one that we're seeing, we saw a lot of this year, is the inability to fly under IFR conditions, which are instrument flight rules. We're just now in the fire service starting to enter into nighttime fire, aggressive fire attack using aircraft at night. It's still limited to rotor wing aircraft, but it's still in the early stages. There's a lot to be worked out there. It's a very, very risky environment to be flying aircraft at night on a wildland fire. And you have to remember, a lot of these wildland fires are not out in the middle of the forest. They're right on the periphery of cities. So you're flying into controlled airspaces at night with all kinds of unknown, unseen risks. So that's the first thing, is the IFR conditions and the inability to fly at night and under smoky conditions. The smoke situation that we witnessed this year precluded a lot of the aerial firefighting operations. Aircraft, both rotor wing and fixed wing, were shut down or relegated to just small areas of the complex fires that we saw this year, not only in California, but in some of the other states. So the inability to see. The next thing is, when you're dropping, it's a very complex dynamic environment. You've got to match your target to your wind speed, your crosswinds, your drop height, and just your accuracy on the drop. If you miss, it's going to take some time before you can come back and attack it again. Aerial firefighting is really dependent on good, accurate drops. And when you're trying to do that under high wind conditions, it's almost impossible to be accurate. And we're seeing that more and more. I witnessed it personally in 2017 and 2018 when we were trying to drop in 30 to 40 mile an hour winds. It's almost impossible to be effective at that point, and we're seeing increased winds on these fires. The other element that we witnessed again this year is the California airspace, the fire traffic area, which is a cone of controlled airspace over the fire, is enormously complex. It is a ballet with aircraft. There is zero tolerance for any kind of aerial mishap. And you're flying aircraft from 500 feet up to over 6,000 feet AGL above these fires, with aircraft entering the airspace, aircraft departing the airspace, and aircraft moving throughout the airspace in a fluid motion. It's a very, very complex airspace. And so that limits your aerial operations. I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, I think we certainly saw the IFR condition problem at our fire, at the CZU complex fire, where I think the first maybe 3 days of that fire, there was nothing flying because everybody was just grounded. But that's one of the things. One of the limitations we're trying to overcome with unmanned technology is the use of infrared cameras and also simply that these drones can fly 100% by GPS. So, for example, if you're doing, say you want to do a logistics run to bring some supplies to firefighters on the ground, or you want to drop a controlled burn line from one of these drones, that you can program that all through GPS, and the aircraft can fly completely blind, but it can also provide infrared camera feeds that go right through the smoke to firefighters on the ground. So that's one of the things we're working on. Sevan, I think it'd be great to get your perspective here about maybe some of the limitations that firefighters on the ground face, and what kind of technologies might be brought to bear to support them and increase their effectiveness and safety. I think a lot of people have a kind of a preconception that these big fires are fought from the sky, right? You see these great images of a 747 flying by, dropping all the red stuff on the fire, and you think, well, that's what's going to put the fire out. But I think in reality, it's this incredible work that's being done on the ground that's just very backbreaking and challenging. Can you speak to some of those challenges and what technologies might be able to be brought to bear there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think to the point about the fire being fought from the sky, to a certain extent, I actually agree with that. Overall, in terms of the ability to contain certain forward progress, because we're talking about fires that get so large. If you were to look at firefighters around it, they would look like ants, crawling around a mountain. So the benefit that we really bring is any high-risk targets, structures, homes, humans. We can really intervene in that sense. Or if the fire is small enough in scale and we have enough personnel, we can definitely, get access early enough to hopefully kind of wrap our arms around the fire before it turns into a big problem. But once we get into these really large-scale fires, we run into problems with the length of operational periods. I mean, there's fatigue for the firefighters. A lot of the challenges we face deals with access and egress to the areas that actually need our attention. They're often narrow roadways. They're places we're unfamiliar with. And oftentimes there's only one way in and one way out for us. And if you commit to a long, narrow road to try to protect a structure or affect a rescue if somebody decided not to evacuate, for example. We try to predict as best we can with weather conditions and topography what the fire behavior is going to do, because we don't want to cut ourselves off in a cul-de-sac basically of a fire ring where we can't take the road we try to access in back out. And, as you compound these little issues and you compound the big issues of the scope and scales of these fires with the limitations on rotating personnel in and out, the limitations of equipment, because oftentimes we carry our water in on our apparatus, on the engines. There may not be hydrants once that water's out. We have shovels. We can throw dust and dirt at fires, which we do, and sometimes it helps, but often is not enough. Logistical support is a huge challenge that we face in many of these places. And I don't know that it was kind of historically, fiscally possible to focus on these little resupply operations, whether it's even drinking water for the firefighters or more equipment. It could be fuel for chainsaws. To cut a line, to separate where the fire is to where we hope it will not go through these lines that we cut. All these things can also be remediated and actually increase and multiply our capabilities out in the field drastically. So both to what Chief Watson was mentioning regarding the aerial operations, working in IFR, actually being able to bring water drops in very challenging topography at night, as well, or other materials, retardants, or other materials that we maybe hadn't explored previously because it didn't make sense in the helicopter or fixed wing context we've been used to for so many decades. There are a lot of new opportunities that are going to present themselves, both in terms of suppressant materials, in tactical and operational aspects to eliminate or extinguish the fire, as well as provide constant resupply to working personnel on the ground, trying to mitigate, the fire and the hazard.
Right. Yeah. And just to speak to what we're trying to do as a company, really the three key applications that we've identified are this logistics for firefighters on the ground, just like what you're talking about, making sure they have the food, the water, the tools, the fuel, everything they need to do their job 24/7, and kind of making that supply chain easier, so they don't have to expend their energy getting the supplies, and they can really spend their energy fighting the fire, And also I think there's a morale aspect there where if you haven't had a hot meal in a week, you know, having a drone come and bringing you a hot meal makes you that much more effective on the ground. So logistics is really one application, and then controlled burns is another application. Parallel is working with a supplier that builds a controlled burn payload, and we're going to expand this for use on our aircraft so that we can do these larger scale controlled burns. And this, you know, can be done at night. This can be done in smoke inversions where there's just zero visibility. And this has been demonstrated with small electric drones, but they just don't cover enough area. So we'll be scaling that up. And then I would say application 3.0 that we're looking toward is, you know, scaling up our own technology and being able to, you know, effectively carry, say, 50 gallons of water and put some spot fires out. So those are the three things that we're looking at doing on our side. I guess I want to understand, in terms of solutions, what kind of data is missing right now? Like when you guys are out in the field fighting these fires, or even before a fire happens, what are the gaps in the data that's being made available, or maybe even in how that data is made available to the community? Rodrigo, is that something you can speak to for us?
Sure. So in a traditional big data strategy, so for anybody from corporate America who has gone through a big data analytics revolution in their organization, there are three important phases. One is detection or sensors, so getting your data pheromones pipe into the system. The second one would be the modeling, the analytics that go into that part. And the third one would be your intervention, whatever kind of intervention you're looking for. In this case, your intervention would be to increase dramatically your capacity to respond. So in the detection side, I mean, we are, when you consider the state of the art in other fields and what we have right now, we are way behind, right? The more I've been learning about this, the more I started studying. Like you, I was affected by that thunderstorm. I was surprised. More than 600 points of impact, right? 600 points of lightning, and we don't necessarily have a capacity to immediately know out of all those thousands of lightings, which ones ignited a fire, what happened, and have an eye in the sky immediately to know what was the case, right? So we need to dramatically increase the footprint of our sensor and detection capabilities in California, probably throughout the West Coast, but certainly in California. We have to get it to a point in which basically we can force multiply what is already satellite information and aircraft information. And in that regard, swarms of drones is one of those places that we're all looking at as a potential way of dramatically. Once you have the data, the second part is the modeling part, because there is a sweet spot here. And the metaphor that I've been using is that of cancer. So there is a point in which cancer can be attacked with chemotherapy, radiotherapy, and other mechanisms. And there's a point in which that cancer will metastasize or grow beyond a point in which our current understanding of medical science can deal with that. And the reality is that right now, we don't know what would be the perfect crossroad of that size of the fire versus installed capacity of drones in a box throughout the state. And getting that information would be very important. It goes to the question that Gianni Reina had on the chat when she was asked, she or he, I don't know, Gianni, sorry if I'm making a mistake here, that the idea would be that once you have this technology deployed, you actually can employ artificial intelligence and other kinds of machine learning to get very good at knowing what is happening. Mike has a point. We don't even have good data right now on the effectiveness of fire suppression from the air. So this is the kind of things that if you started to have autonomous systems that can fly day and night, that can start swarming and pounding that fire, at the same time that they're operating in their mission space, they're also capturing data of perimeters, of behavior, of level of intensity of the fires, of amber, of wind conditions. And all of those things are things that right now a human being would have a hard time correlating, but a computer can do a good job. So it's not only the data that's missing, it's also the modeling capabilities for us to become better at our job, and now decide where are we going to let that fire continue, when or for how long, where are we going to be burning that million of acres a year to make sure that it's the environment is healthy and all that stuff, right? In order for us to make evidence-based, well thought choices and give firefighters the best tools to become really good at providing solutions that keep their lives out of risk and harm, we need to get a lot better sensors, a lot better data, and also great modeling capability behind it.
Great. Yeah, and I see someone from the chat there is asking, would love to understand current use of UAVs by firefighters. Also, what is needed to better use UAVs, especially larger ones? And I think let's just talk about what's currently being done right now. And I think this really ties into the concept of the data and the data quality. So I know, for example, the Department of Interior has a very significant UAS fleet that's leveraged for wildfire, and a lot of that is being used to get better situational awareness. So they're putting infrared eyes in the sky, visual camera eyes in the sky to be able to direct the folks on the ground to the locations they need to go. And then also, as I mentioned, they're starting to use the kind of current drone technology for a controlled burn drop. So I know that's going on. Sevan or Scott, can either of you speak to what you've seen going on, maybe at the state or local level, or even the federal level, with UAS technology in firefighting?
I can speak to that. Right now, primarily, at least in California and the western states, we're seeing unstaffed, unmanned aircraft being used primarily for recon and mapping and aerial inputs like spread rates, such like that. So it's purely an observation platform. Primarily, you're not seeing them in suppression. You're not seeing them in support of ground personnel and logistics. Those two are probably the two where the new technology needs to go. The military is assisting with remote sensing. I'm not aware of seeing drones being used for detection at this point. I think there's some limited use for detection. I think it is going on. I'm not really aware of it personally, but obviously that technology is there, it's present, and we could be using small, agile drones to be doing detection work, which, as Rodrigo had mentioned, is going to really increase our database and also increase the primary element that's really missing is immediate detection of heat sources at the incipient stage. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Sevan.
Yeah, I think one of the big challenges that has maybe, I'm going to say, stunted the progress or sort of evolution of the use of drones, although it's still going pretty fast, has really been the integration of drones into the federal airspace system and how they work and operate around other firefighting aircraft. And that's been a big challenge. And because we haven't really been talking about having the platforms available to engage in the suppression component or some of these other more complex or involved aspects of wildland firefighting, they've really just sort of fallen into the situational awareness category, where when a fire is there, it's brought to the fire by fire resources or maybe a contractor or someone like that, and then deployed under very limited and specific context to try to gain some of that situational awareness, the mapping, the things that Chief Watson was talking about. The FAA had kind of been a sticking point because they were just trying to figure out, what to do with the drones overall. That's moving forward well, and I think as the new opportunities present themselves realistically with what these drones can actually provide in terms of service or resource, Again, we're going to be pushing against that policy wall in a way and pushing it forward so that we can integrate them more and more into all aspects of the operation. But that's been a bit of a challenge, I think. Less from the technology side, more from the policy side. You know, a lot of organizations, you know, being government entities, are also reluctant to, you know, high risk experimentation. So they want to make sure the policies are in place, the rules are very well established, and then integrate new technologies that way. So those are a couple of things that I've been observing.
Great.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you to all of the attendees who have been chiming in with great questions. We're going to move into the Q&A portion, going a little bit over time here. So if you are available, stick around for another 15 minutes or so. We'll continue answering your questions now. And again, if we happen to miss your question today, please feel free to send them via email to the email address provided in the chat. So starting off with one of the questions that we had, Joshua, this one would be for you. What is the current aircraft platform and fuel? And then what is the flight duration and with what payload for the Parallel Flight Technologies aircraft?
Great. Yeah, I'm looking at that question in the chat there. So the aircraft that we're going to really be debuting that's going to be able to go out into the field is it runs on a gasoline and oil mix, and this has been indicated by the firefighting community to us as kind of the ideal fuel source because they already have it available for their various tools and stuff like that. And the payload for the beta level aircraft that we're going to be fielding really the beginning of 2021 is 100 pounds. So that's really the maximum payload that you can take off with also a full tank of fuel. And in terms of duration, we're getting some pretty exciting numbers back. We actually are testing some of this stuff just last week, and it looks like we'll be able to carry that payload for around 2 hours in hover, which is you know, very significantly longer than any kind of all-electric solution. And you know, you're also asking about, you know, 50 gallons of water. What's the time frame for that development? It's a little hard to say right now. I think we really need to get our beta level aircraft out in 2021, move into full production with that 100-pound aircraft, and then begin development towards the next, you know, larger generation. So, you know, I think it'd be safe to say that's at least 2 years out, maybe 3. It's a little hard to say. You know, it's just when you make those kind of big jumps in technology, it's you know, obviously it's challenging. So I hope that answers the question. You know, we're working with FAA on the required waivers and exemptions that are needed, but the FAA has indicated that, you know, for these wildfire applications, they're going to try to make this a seamless process.
Great. And sort of a follow-up to that, another question from another attendee is asking about the GPS used, if it works throughout dense smoke. So the question is, does GPS indeed work through dense smoke? A drone can probably fly with the IMU for a while, but bouncy wind and rotorcraft vibrations probably limit its accuracy due to drift. Is this an area where research is still needed? So does anybody want to speak to that subject?
Sure. I mean, I can say that to my knowledge that smoke is not a problem for GPS. I don't know if Scott or Rodrigo or Sevan, if any of you have any other experience with that. Like, we've certainly never encountered it.
No, the GPS should be able to, or not GPS and infrared technologies combined will be able to overcome the smoke and visual limitations.
Great.
And one of the questions that we had was relating back to the Australian wildfires and how they compare to the US. So the question was, Australian forestry scientists believe the amount of acreage or hectares there burned per year has increased 650% since 1973. Are there any historic statistics on the amount of acreage burned per year in the US over the last 20 years?
Yeah, this is actually a great question. You know, I've been seeing some stuff floating around social media where it shows our current acreage getting burned each year being, you know, 4 times less than what was happening around the turn of the century. And I was very skeptical about that. And we've had, you know, with this group, some interesting conversations about that data. So I want to speak to that, but then also to the question, Rodrigo, why don't you take that one up? Because I know we've discussed this before.
Yeah, so there's a chart that has been floating around that Joshua sent me. It's one that kind of asks to dismiss the importance of climate change in the current trend. And the reality is that America has been burning part of its forest for a long time. And as part of industrialization during the gold rush era, a lot of California burned. Those were basically prescribed fires. They were fires that people did on purpose in order to either clear space for the building of infrastructure, cities, or roads, etc. We are seeing an increase in the amount of acreage being burned every year, uncontrolled. And this is a core issue, right? It goes to the discussion we had before. What we want in California is not to stop fires. That would be a mistake we kind of made in the past. The idea of no fire is a mistake. We want to increase, actually, as I said right now, acres per year, if any, of controlled burn. That million of acres being burned would still have a smaller environmental impact by orders of magnitude of what we're seeing right now. So it would actually be better for the environment because it would prevent these catastrophic, uncontrolled wildfires. So, and that becomes trickier. Getting a clear number of how much of the forest of California or Oregon or Washington State burns every year uncontrolled, what is the impact? Those data sets exist. They tend to be fragmented. They tend to be all over the place. Joshua, you were evacuated. I was under an evacuation warning. It was even hard for evacuees to actually go and find a single point, a single map where they could know where they had to go. That data does not get aggregated. It does not get stored later. That data exists, but any data scientist in the call knows that data that is not aggregated and correctly structured is almost like if there's no data at all. So one of the challenges certainly is to start getting better at answering those questions of where, how far, how much, and having a single repository of data would be a great place to start.
Right.
Can I add one word to that response as well, Joshua?
Yeah, of course.
The other thing we have to remember is these numbers have to be looked at relatively over time because obviously urban sprawl, population growth, when we're talking about some of the needs for suppression, they really pertain to preserving life and property. And so even though if we see a dip in acreage one particular year, it doesn't necessarily mean that the real scope of the problem is lesser. It can have a greater fiscal impact if it's somewhere really close to an intermix area where the fire departments are going to be much more aggressive. They're going to call a lot more personnel to engage in the process of trying to mitigate the loss in those particular environments. Rodrigo's mentioned a lot about the need for increasing prescribed burns, tying that also to the climate change issue. And the other question that was asked earlier about areas that had already burnt but that were ready to burn again, which Chief Watson mentioned, the growth of flashy fuels, things we call flashy fuels like grass and things that are not necessarily high density fuels. When these fires go through, not all the fuel is necessarily burnt. I'm sure you've seen plenty of pictures of trees, trunks that are still in place. They're charred on the outside. But in actuality, that is still a large remnant of potential fuel to burn because there's a lot more wood there inside. And as the climate's changing, drought has affected the state tremendously. Temperatures are increasing. A lot of fuels that may not have been considered significant fuels in the past are also becoming more susceptible to reigniting in these situations. That's made it really difficult, to take kind of the leap in certain cases and do some, fuel mitigation fires and try to do that. What we need, of course, as Rodrigo's been mentioning, is that data aggregation and study, because the basis on which these decisions need to be made itself is shifting as the climate and the environment is completely changing the relationship between temperatures, sun exposure, topography aspect, etc., and the propensity for these fuels to ignite, reignite, and then the rate of spread, of course. So all those elements come into play, and it really creates a very dynamic, difficult to predict conundrum. And we need big data to help with modeling and prediction.
Great. What other questions do we have there, Sarah?
Yeah, so a question for Chief Watson. If you could define an ideal UAV configuration for logistics and fire suppression, what would that be? Range, payload, or endurance? And maybe it's a combination of a few, so.
Well, it's a real trade-off between payload and endurance. The heavier the payload, the shorter the endurance and the less range. In my way of thinking, from a ground pounder way of looking at things, I would like to see a payload of about 200 pounds, 150, 200 pounds. 200 pounds would be really great, both for fire suppression and for logistical support of ground crews. You have to understand, those are two completely different tactical operations for the drone. So the ability to transfer from one payload package to another would be critical for success of the drone. And the other success for the drone would be for them to work in tandem. We've bounced around the concept of swarm technology. If I could launch for the same cost 5 or 6 drones to support, say, a division on a fire, they can stay in the air and extend the range and the payload by working in unison as essentially a team of drones. That ability to work in tandem, it would be critically important for the drone program. So 200 pounds, hour and a half or so duration in flight, that's a perfect combination.
Great. Yeah, so I also see Charles Werner asking about the payload of Beta and what kind of logistical support would be helpful. So Beta payload is going to be 100 pounds. That's set up as a quad rotor. It certainly would be possible without significant development to set that up as an octa rotor and therefore have 200 pounds of payload. But at first, we're going to be set up as a quad with 100 pounds. And in terms of what kinds of payloads we're looking at, for example, a cubitainer of water, so that's a 5-gallon box of drinking water, and then with the controlled burns, being able to carry 3,000 to 4,000 ignition spheres and the drop mechanism, all of this kind of, fits within that 100-pound payload. Actually, two of those cubitainers of water, chainsaws, things like that.
Fire hose.
Fire hose, yep.
Fire hose and fuel. First thing that's going to stop a hand crew is when they run out of water. And the second thing that's going to stop a hand crew is when they run out of chainsaw mix. A drone can easily support 2 or 3 crews or a strike team of crews. Drones can be used to support bulldozers working out there on the fire line. So for right now, short-term remedy, 100-pound payload, we could do an awful lot with a 100-pound payload in the realm of tactical logistical support of ground units.
I think this is really important, Joshua, because one thing that we didn't mention and we probably should have put a lot more accent into it is that any technology development, it has a path, right? So you start somewhere, you end somewhere else. And what we're aiming here, there is this what I like to call the Star Trek vision or forest firefighting, which is the long-term view of what we should be doing, which is something I already described, a pervasive sensor capability that detects any fire and it's able to suppress it at any point if we so choose to. We might decide not to, but that becomes but before we get to that point, the ramp that gets us there is really important. And the ramp is the one that you're describing here, supporting logistics so that mission can happen now, not 20 years into the future, allowing, and this is something that the big boxes, the Sikorsky's, they are already working on, to automate existing platforms so you can fly them without a pilot when necessary, but your cost of operation is still there, getting all the way to swarming technology, right? So the Department of Defense is already toying with the idea, what we call this, the drone in a box, right? These technologies that you would put a drone with a solar panel in the middle of the boonies and you put thousands of them, right? We're not talking about a few hundred. And if you think those numbers are radical, well, a single sortie of the 747 that CAL fires can be $500,000, right? So just that single drop of 1 or 2 drops of fire retardant. So we're talking about, at the same time, the alternative, it's already a very expensive one and it's gonna get more expensive. So using the technologies now to support operations now does 2 things. One is helps us get better now, but secondly, it provides the research and development test bed for us to keep doing work to get better to the next generation. And aiming for that generation is really important. Beta molds, like the world Parallel is about to build, are really important because they're teaching us what we need to do to get to what I'm calling the Star Trek vision of a perfectly well swarm operated mix of multiple kinds of aircraft helping us fight the fires that match the level of the challenge.
Awesome. Yeah, we definitely, follow that kind of crawl, walk, run approach and try to do the, kind of what we can do in the short term to start changing the game and then build from there to that kind of Star Trek future. So anyway, we're really hitting our time here. I want to thank all of our panelists and attendees. And Sarah as our MC for putting this all together and attending. It's been great to have everybody here. So thanks everybody. We will follow up with an email, try to get some of these other questions answered and provide a link to the recording. Sarah, is there any other final housekeeping for our attendees?
No, I think that's all it. Thank you. Thank you so much to our panelists and thank you to the attendees. You all have asked some amazing questions and we will work towards getting you the answers in the coming weeks. So thank you all so much.
All right, have a great day.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.